The street was alive with the usual chaos: honking cars, hurried footsteps, and the occasional street musician playing an off-tune melody. Pedestrians bustled through the sidewalks of downtown Chicago, their faces buried in their phones or lost in thought. No one noticed the man in the tailored suit weaving through the crowd, his impatience visible in every aggressive step. Then it happened. A sudden yelp, a sharp, heart-wrenching cry of pain cut through the air, stopping a few people in their tracks. A golden retriever, wearing a blue therapy vest, stumbled backward, its soft eyes filled with confusion and hurt. The man in the suit, his face twisted in irritation, muttered something under his breath, shaking out his foot as if the mere presence of the dog had soiled his expensive shoes. "Get that filthy mutt out of my way," he spat, shoving past a horrified woman who had been holding the therapy dog's leash. Gasps erupted from the small crowd that had begun to gather. The woman, a frail but determined figure in her mid-50s, knelt beside the golden retriever, running trembling fingers through its fur. "Buddy, are you okay?" Her voice cracked, thick with concern. The retriever's tail, which had been wagging just moments ago, drooped. His ears flattened, his body stiff with uncertainty. This wasn't the first time someone had ignored his presence, but it was the first time someone had physically hurt him. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. She wasn't just Buddy's handler. She wasn't just his owner. She was his lifeline. The day had started like any other. Linda had woken up at sunrise. The soft sound of Buddy's rhythmic breathing the first thing to greet her. She reached down from her bed, her fingers brushing against his thick fur. "Ready for another day, my boy," she whispered, her voice filled with the kind of love only years of companionship could cultivate. Buddy lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting hers with unbreakable loyalty. His tail thumped against the floor. He didn't need words. His entire world revolved around her. Linda had been diagnosed with severe PTSD 5 years ago. She had lost her husband in a tragic car accident, and since then, every crowded street, every honking car, every unexpected sound sent her spiraling into panic. But Buddy was her anchor. He could sense the anxiety before it took hold, pressing his warm body against her leg, grounding her. Today, like always, they were heading to the community center, where Buddy helped other veterans cope with their trauma. He wasn't just her therapy dog. He was a source of comfort for so many who had lost everything. But no one could have predicted what would happen that afternoon. No one could have predicted him. The man in the suit, Daniel Reed, wasn't just another businessman in a rush. He was someone used to getting his way. Raised in privilege, accustomed to power, he had little patience for distractions. The therapy dog had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Buddy had been trained to handle stress, to remain calm in difficult situations. But the sheer force of the kick had sent a jolt of pain through his small frame, something he had never experienced before. And Linda, his strong, unshakable Linda, was trembling beside him. The small crowd that had gathered stared at Daniel in disbelief. "Hey man, what's wrong with you?" someone called out. "You just kicked a therapy dog," another voice added, laced with anger. Daniel barely spared them a glance. "It's a dog," he scoffed, adjusting his suit as if the very conversation bored him. "People shouldn't bring animals onto public sidewalks if they can't control them." Linda stood up slowly, her frail hands tightening around Buddy's leash. Her chest rose and fell as she struggled to contain the fury burning inside her. "He's not just a dog," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "He's my best friend. He's the reason I'm standing here instead of locked away in fear. And you—" Her gaze hardened, something fierce igniting behind her usually weary eyes. "You're going to regret this," Daniel smirked. "Oh, please. What's a little mutt like that going to do? The universe has a funny way of balancing things. Sometimes karma waits. Other times it strikes with terrifying precision." And Daniel was about to learn that the hard way. As he walked away, brushing off the incident like it was nothing, the world carried on as if nothing had happened. But fate was already moving its invisible pieces into place. A few blocks away, a black SUV was idling at the curb, its tinted windows concealing the two men inside. They had been waiting for someone, anyone, who fit the profile of an easy target. A well-dressed man, distracted, oblivious to his surroundings. Someone too full of himself to notice the danger lurking nearby. Daniel Reed never saw them coming. As he rounded the corner, checking his phone, he barely had time to react before a rough hand grabbed him by the collar. "Not so fast, big shot," a gruff voice sneered. Daniel's instincts kicked in, but before he could protest, he felt cold steel press against his back. His breath hitched. This wasn't happening, but it was. The irony was almost poetic. Moments ago, he had felt powerful, untouchable. But now? Now, he was just another helpless victim. The street had suddenly emptied, as if fate itself had orchestrated. The perfect moment for retribution. The two men dragged him into the alley, their movements precise, practiced. This wasn't their first time. "Wallet, watch, phone," the second man demanded. Daniel's fingers fumbled as he reached into his pocket. His heart pounded. The world spun. Then a low, menacing growl sliced through the tension like a knife. Daniel froze. The men froze. From the shadows, a familiar figure emerged. Golden fur, sharp eyes, a blue vest that read, "Therapy Dog." Buddy stood. At the entrance of the alley, his ears perked, his stance firm. But this wasn't the gentle therapy dog the world knew. No, this was something different, something primal, a force that could not be ignored. The robbers exchanged uneasy glances. They had planned for security guards, cameras, maybe even an undercover. "Copped him, but a dog?" "Shoo mutt," one of them hissed. Buddy didn't move. His growl deepened. His tail was still, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to launch. And then, in a blur of gold, he did. The attack was swift, precise. Buddy lunged at the man holding the gun, his teeth sinking into his arm before he could react. The man howled, in pain, dropping the weapon as Buddy twisted, knocking him off balance. The second attacker stumbled back, panic flashing across his face. "Get the hell off him!" he shouted, reaching for something in his pocket. A sharp whistle pierced the air, Linda's whistle. And just like that, Buddy released his grip, stepping back with military precision, his eyes locked onto the second man like a warning. The would-be robbers scrambled to their feet, cursing under their breath as they bolted out of the alley. Daniel stood there, paralyzed, his breath ragged. His expensive suit was torn, his pride even more so. He turned, locking eyes with Buddy. The same dog he had kicked, the same dog who had just saved his life. Linda emerged from behind the alley, her eyes never leaving Daniel's. "I told you," she said quietly, kneeling beside Buddy, running her fingers through his fur. "You were going to regret it." Daniel swallowed hard, his arrogance shattered, and for the first time in his life he had nothing to say. The bustling city street hummed with life. Cars honked, distant sirens wailed, and hurried footsteps clicked against the pavement. But amidst the chaos, a silence stretched between two figures, a man and a dog. Ethan took a cautious step forward, his throat tight with anticipation. His heart pounded as he crouched, extending his hand toward Max, the German shepherd who had once been his lifeline. "Max, it's me, buddy," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the sounds of the city. But the dog didn't move. No spark of recognition flickered in his deep brown eyes. No eager tail wag, no joyful bark. Nothing. Max simply stood there, his ears twitching slightly, his gaze distant, almost wary. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Ethan had imagined this moment 1,000 times. The second he'd heard about Max's whereabouts, he'd rushed to find him, barely able to believe his luck. After months of searching, endless nights spent, scouring shelters and making calls, he was finally here, face to face with his old friend. But this was a nightmare. Max wasn't just different, he was a stranger. Ethan's fingers curled into his palm. The dog before him looked like Max, but there was something missing. The trust, the familiarity, the bond that had once been unbreakable. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some had witnessed what had happened earlier, the incident that had led to this very moment. The stranger, the cruel kick, the gasps of bystanders. And now Ethan standing here, desperate to bridge a gap that felt impossibly wide. Ethan took another cautious step forward, ignoring the way the damp city air clung to his skin. "Max, it's me," he tried again, softer this time. Max's ears twitched, but his body remained rigid. His muscles were coiled like a wound-up spring ready to bolt at any second. Ethan's stomach sank. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the blank look in Max's eyes or the way he didn't even flinch at his voice. Memories crashed over him like a tidal wave, the day he had first met Max as a puppy, cradling the tiny bundle of fur in his arms, the years of unwavering companionship. The day Max had placed his paw on Ethan's knee when he thought his world was falling apart, and the last time he had seen him, watching helplessly as Max was taken away. A sharp ache burned behind Ethan's ribs. Had Max forgotten him, or worse, had he been taught to? A gruff voice broke through the moment. "If the dog don't remember you, he ain't yours." Ethan turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. The man who had kicked Max earlier, the one who had started this whole mess, stood with his arms crossed, a smug smirk playing at his lips. "You should move on," the man continued. "Dog's got a new life now, probably better off." Ethan's jaw clenched. A surge of anger flared in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't let this turn into another scene. This wasn't about proving something to a cruel stranger. This was about Max. Ethan forced himself to breathe. Stay calm. Focus. Max needed him, even if he didn't know it yet. Ignoring the man, Ethan slowly knelt, pulling something from his pocket. An old worn-out dog tag. Max's name was still etched onto it. Though time had dulled the engraving, Ethan placed it gently on the ground between them. "Remember this?" he murmured, his voice raw with emotion. Max's eyes flickered to the object. A moment passed, then another. Ethan held his breath. Max's nose twitched. He took a hesitant step forward, his nostrils flaring as he caught the faint scent of something familiar, something from another life. Ethan's heart pounded. Could this be it? Could this be the moment everything changed? Then, just as quickly, Max's body tensed again. His gaze darted up, scanning his surroundings. His ears flattened against his head, and then he turned away. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Max didn't just walk away. He recoiled. The dog he had once loved more than anything had flinched at his presence. Ethan's knees felt weak. The world around him blurred. The city noise faded into a dull hum. It felt like someone had reached inside his chest and squeezed. Max had been his best friend, his partner, his family. And now? Now he was just another man in a crowd. The sting of rejection cut deeper than Ethan had ever thought possible. He pressed his fingers against his forehead, forcing himself to stay composed. But inside he was breaking. A hand touched his shoulder. An elderly woman who had been watching nearby offered a gentle smile. "Dogs don't forget love," she said softly, "but sometimes they need time to remember." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Time. That was what he had. To give Max. Even if it hurt. Even if it shattered him. Because no matter how lost Max seemed right now, Ethan refused to believe their story was over. Not yet. Not ever. The days bled together. Ethan sat on the cracked, weathered bench outside the shelter, staring at the small window that led to the area where Max had been kept. Each morning he arrived before the sun rose, his body stiff from the cold night air, and each evening he left after the sun had dipped below the horizon, exhausted, defeated, but not ready to give up. Max's indifference was the hardest part to bear. He had always been the dog who could sense Ethan's moods, the one who had been by his side through thick and thin. But now, Max acted like he didn't even know him. The dog was a stranger. Ethan wasn't sure how much more of this he could take. Every attempt felt like a failure, but he refused to leave. It was the simplest of ideas. A squeaky ball. Ethan could still hear the sound of it bouncing off the walls of their old apartment, the high-pitched squeak that always made Max's ears perk up. It was a symbol of their past, of the joy they had shared. He grabbed the worn ball from his bag and walked into the shelter, feeling the weight of the moment on his shoulders. Max was lying in the corner, his back to Ethan. The dog hadn't even moved when Ethan approached. His tail, once so lively, was now still, but Ethan wasn't ready to give up. He crouched slowly, holding out the ball in front of him. "Max," he said, his voice steady but filled with longing. "Remember this?" The dog's ears twitched, and for a moment, Ethan thought there might be a flicker of recognition in Max's eyes. But when the ball squeaked in his hand, Max only looked up for a split second before turning away again. Ethan's heart sank. The dog had no interest in the ball, no desire to chase it. It was as if their past together had no meaning to him now. The next day, Ethan tried something different, something that had always worked in the past. He knew Max's commands like the back of his hand. Sit, stay, roll over. Simple commands, but they were a bond, a language they had shared for years. He stood in front of Max, who was sitting idly by the door, looking out the window. "Max, sit." The words came out naturally, as if they were just another part of the world they had once shared. Max didn't respond, he just stared ahead, his eyes distant. "Sit, Max." Still nothing. Ethan's pulse quickened. The silence between them grew heavier, suffocating. He could feel his throat closing in as he tried again, his voice softer now. "Please, Max. Sit." Max's eyes flicked toward him for a moment, but then, without warning, he stood up and walked to the far corner of the room. His tail tucked low, Ethan's body went cold. The words that had once been so familiar, so trusted, had no power now. He was losing him. Ethan refused to believe that it was hopeless. There had to be something, some way to reach Max again. That evening, after another failed attempt, he sat on the bench and pulled out his phone. There in the camera roll was a picture that meant everything. It was a photo from one of their last days together, a picture of Max with his head on Ethan's lap, eyes full of trust, the sun setting behind them. Ethan stared at the screen, his finger lightly tracing the image. "Remember this," he whispered, though he knew the dog couldn't hear him. He wasn't sure if it was the photo itself or the flood of memories it brought back, but something in his chest ached with a deep, primal yearning. This dog, this friend, had been with him through everything, through heartache, through healing. How could Max not remember that? Ethan showed the photo to the shelter workers the next morning, asking if they could display it near Max's kennel. It was an act of desperation, one that made him feel vulnerable, but he didn't care. He was running out of options. They agreed, and Ethan watched silently as the picture was pinned to the wall of the small room Max stayed in. For a brief moment, he thought it might help, might stir something inside the dog. But when he saw Max, again later that day, nothing had changed. Max walked by the photo as if it meant nothing. The next few days were a blur of effort and failure. Ethan tried everything he could think of, taking Max on walks through the park they used to frequent, trying to recreate their old routines, calling his name in every way he knew would get Max's attention. But the more he tried, the more Max seemed to withdraw. The rejection stung like 1,000 small cuts, and yet every time he thought about giving up, he saw Max's face, those soft, trusting eyes from their past. He remembered the way Max had always been his protector, his companion. That image of Max's head on his lap, content and safe, refused to fade from his mind. One evening, as he sat outside the shelter, feeling utterly defeated, the memory of their first night together returned with startling clarity. It was a cold, rainy night when Ethan had first adopted Max. He had been living alone in a small apartment, battling through an especially dark period in his life. He hadn't expected the dog to make such an impact, but from the moment Max had curled up on the couch beside him, things had changed. They hadn't spoken, but there had been a quiet understanding between them. Max had been the first one to sleep through the night without restlessness, as if he too needed healing. Ethan had whispered softly into the darkness, "It's just you and me, Max." Max had looked at him, those brown eyes filled with an unspoken promise. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan had felt like he wasn't alone. That night, after yet another failed attempt to reach Max, Ethan sat on the bench once more. This time, though, he felt different. Tired, yes, but not hopeless. As he glanced up at the shelter door, he saw Max sitting by the window, staring out into the rain. For For the first time in weeks, Max didn't look anxious, didn't look distant. He just sat there calm as though he was waiting for something. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply sat there, his back against the cold metal of the bench, eyes locked on Max. And then, a moment later, something miraculous happened. Max shifted, and for the first time since their reunion, he stood up, his eyes still, locked on Ethan. Slowly he walked toward him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He held his breath, terrified that the moment would pass, that Max would turn away. But instead the dog stopped just in front of him, tail slightly wagging. Without a sound, Max nudged his nose against Ethan's hand. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Ethan slowly extended his fingers, brushing them over Max's fur, a tear slipping down his cheek. Max hadn't forgotten. It was just going to take time. The days stretched out before Ethan like a never-ending horizon. Every morning he awoke with the same determination, the same hope that today might be the day Max would finally remember him. And yet, each evening he left the shelter with the same emptiness gnawing at his heart. But there was a subtle shift. Max, though still distant, was no longer completely indifferent. The brief moments where their eyes met, where Max didn't turn away, were becoming more frequent. It was as if the dog was slowly, cautiously testing the waters of their bond. Ethan refused to be discouraged. He kept coming back, each day a new attempt, each one more hopeful than the last. One afternoon, after a long week of trying and failing, Ethan decided to take a different approach. The park. It had been their place, his and Max's, the vast open spaces, the freedom to run and play, to breathe and live. It was a place where Max had always been at his happiest. Perhaps the familiar sense, the echoes of their past adventures could help spark something. Ethan stood at the gate of the shelter, holding the leash in his hand, his heart racing with anticipation. He had never felt more unsure about anything. In his life, he could already imagine the rejection, the coldness, the indifference. But what if? What if today is the day? He whispered to himself, more for his own encouragement than anything else. Max was lying in the corner of the room when Ethan entered, his eyes flicking toward him. For a moment, there was nothing, no recognition, no spark of recognition. But then Max's ears twitched. "Max," Ethan said softly, his voice trembling. "Let's go to the park." Max didn't respond at first. He just lay there, motionless. But then, after what felt like an eternity, the dog slowly rose to his feet and began walking toward Ethan. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Max hesitated, his eyes flicking back toward the other dogs in the shelter. But then he stepped forward, his tail flicking slightly as if to say, "I'm ready." The leash clicked into place, and they were off. The journey was long, but neither of them cared about the distance. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan could feel a connection, no matter how faint, beginning to bloom between them. The park was just as Ethan remembered it. Lush. Green grass, towering trees, and the faint sound of children laughing in the distance. It was a peaceful place, one that held so many memories. Max's steps were slow at first, uncertain. He sniffed the air, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. But slowly, as if the park was working its magic, Max began to relax. His shoulders loosened, his body language shifting from tense to more fluid, more at ease. Ethan walked beside him, his hand resting lightly on the leash, but he didn't pull, didn't urge. He simply let Max explore at his own pace, giving him space, giving him time. The world around them seemed to disappear as they ventured further into the park. The only thing that mattered was the dog at Ethan's side. Slowly, a miracle began to unfold. Max paused at the base of a tree, a spot they had visited many times before. It was as though the place had triggered something deep within him. He sniffed the tree trunk, his tail giving a tentative wag. His ears perked up, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan saw something in his eyes that he hadn't seen before. Recognition. Ethan knelt beside Max, his voice soft and gentle. "This is our spot, Max. Remember?" Max didn't bark, didn't leap in excitement as he once had. But he looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe it was a spark of recognition, a glimmer of the bond they had shared. It was more than enough for Ethan to hold on to. Max nudged his head against Ethan's knee, a silent gesture of trust. It wasn't the enthusiastic greeting of old, but it was something. Ethan's heart swelled, tears welling up in his eyes. "It's okay, Max," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be okay." As the afternoon faded into evening, they continued their walk through the park. Max had grown more comfortable, and Ethan allowed himself to breathe, to finally believe that maybe, just maybe, they were on the verge of something beautiful. Max began to explore the park with a newfound energy. He trotted ahead, sniffing the ground, his tail wagging cautiously. Ethan followed, watching with awe as the dog gradually returned to his old self. At the pond, Max stopped and stood perfectly still. He stared at his reflection in the water, and for a long moment he didn't move. Ethan watched, heart pounding. It was as if Max was seeing himself, remembering who he was. Suddenly, with a burst of energy, Max lunged toward the water, his paws splashing as he attempted to leap in. Ethan gasped, taking a step forward. It was the old Max, the dog who had always loved the water, who had reveled in the simple joy of chasing sticks and jumping into the pond. Ethan laughed, a sound he hadn't made in weeks. The tension that had been holding him hostage for so long melted away in that moment. He knelt beside the water, calling to Max. "Get it, Max, go!" Max turned, his eyes sparkling with mischief. He charged at the water once more, his movements fluid and graceful. The old Max was back. Ethan couldn't contain his joy. He clapped his hands, urging the dog on. Max came bounding back toward him, his fur wet but his spirit alive, vibrant. As Max reached him, he stopped and looked up at Ethan, his tail wagging furiously. This was it, the moment they had both been waiting for, the moment of connection. Ethan crouched down and wrapped his arms around Max's neck, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I knew you were still in there," he murmured, tears streaming down his face. "I knew you'd come back to me." Max licked his face, his tongue warm and reassuring, a silent promise that they were finally on the same page. They were no longer strangers. They were a team again. As they made their way home that evening, the world felt different. Max's steps were lighter, his body more relaxed. Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in so long. They walked, together, side by side, as if nothing had ever been wrong. When they returned to the shelter, the workers couldn't believe their eyes. Max, once distant and withdrawn, had returned to his true self. There was no more hesitation in his steps, no more blank stares. The dog who had once been so full of life was back, and so was the bond he shared with Ethan. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was a beginning, a new chapter in their story, one where trust was slowly rebuilding, one where the past wasn't forgotten, but was instead used as a foundation for something even stronger. Ethan looked at Max, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. They had both been through so much, but they had made it through the other side, and together they would face whatever came next. "I'm so proud of you," Ethan whispered, stroking Max's fur. Max rested his head against Ethan's leg, a quiet contentment settling over them both, and in that moment Ethan knew without a doubt that everything would be okay. The breakthrough had come, and from here on out, there was no turning back. The days after their breakthrough were a blur of healing, both for Ethan and Max. The park, once a place of bittersweet memories, had become their sanctuary. Each visit was a step toward rebuilding what had been lost, a connection that was no longer fragile but slowly gaining strength. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he had felt so fulfilled, so connected to the world around him. Max had been different since that day by the pond. The shadows of the past still lingered, but now there was a light in his eyes that had been absent for too long. There was joy in his steps, excitement in his tail's wag, and trust in the way he leaned against Ethan's leg whenever they stopped to rest. The bond was solidifying, one moment at a time. It had been weeks since their first walk in the park, and it was clear that Max had regained much of his former self. He was playful again, chasing after sticks, running through the fields, and even trying to catch the birds that fluttered just out of reach. There was an energy to him that Ethan hadn't seen since the accident, and it made him feel like he was finally getting back the companion he had loved so dearly. The shelter was abuzz with excitement as the staff marveled at Max's transformation. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It wasn't just Max's progress that was remarkable, it was theirs. They had both worked tirelessly to get to this point. Ethan had never given up, even when it seemed like there was no hope, and Max had, in his own way, come back to him. But there was still one thing that Ethan knew he needed to do. The shelter had done everything they could, but it was time for Max to leave. It was time for him to go home. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Ethan stopped in front of a bench. Max, as always, sat beside him, content and relaxed. The park had become their haven, but Ethan knew it was time to move beyond it. There were new adventures waiting for them, new memories to create together. "Max," Ethan said softly, looking at the dog beside him, "I think it's time for you to come home with me." Max looked up at him, his eyes steady, as if understanding the weight of what Ethan was saying. In that moment, Ethan realized that Max had already come home in his heart. He had always been there. It was just a matter of believing that it was truly possible. Ethan had been hesitant about this moment for weeks. The fear of losing Max again had kept him from making the final decision, but now, with a steady heart, he knew that he was ready. Max was ready. The next day, Ethan packed up his car, his heart beating with both excitement and nervousness. He wasn't just picking up a dog from the shelter. He was bringing home a friend, a partner, a piece of his soul that had been lost, but now was found again. Max followed him outside, his paws clicking against the pavement as they made their way toward the car. Ethan opened the door, and Max, without hesitation, climbed into the back seat, settling down with a contented sigh. It was as if he knew that this was where he belonged, that this was his home now. As they drove away from the shelter, Ethan couldn't help but glance at Max in the rearview mirror. The dog was calm, peaceful, almost regal in the way he sat there. Ethan smiled, feeling the weight of the journey they had shared together. The car ride felt like a dream. Ethan's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind raced with thoughts of what the future would hold. He knew there would be challenges, but there was also a sense of certainty that had been missing before. They were a team now, and together they could face anything. When they arrived at his house, Max jumped out of the car before Ethan even had a chance to open the door. He trotted up the driveway with a sense of purpose, his head held high. Ethan followed behind, smiling as he watched Max settle into the front yard as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Max's first night in the house was peaceful, and for Ethan, it felt like a dream come true. He prepared a bed for Max in the corner of the living room, a quiet spot near the window where the dog could keep watch over the yard. Max curled up on the blanket, letting out a soft sigh of contentment. Ethan sat on the couch, his eyes on the dog. He didn't need to say anything. The quiet between them spoke volumes. Max had come home. Over the next few weeks, the house began to feel more like a home. Max's playful antics brought a new energy to the place, and his loyalty was unwavering. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. There was no longer a void where Max used to be. He was here, fully, completely, and Ethan could feel the depth of their bond growing stronger every day. But it wasn't just about the bond between them. It was about the joy Max had brought back into Ethan's life. The pain of the past had faded, replaced by a future full of possibility. Max was no longer just the dog who had been rescued. He was the dog who had healed Ethan's broken heart. He was the dog who had given Ethan a reason to believe in second chances. Months passed, and life continued to unfold. Ethan's mornings began with Max at his side, his faithful companion, always ready to start the day. They had found a routine, one that was based on mutual trust and respect. Max's playfulness never ceased to surprise Ethan. Whether it was chasing after a ball in the backyard or running alongside him during his morning jog, Max was always eager to be part of whatever Ethan did. But it wasn't just about the fun and games. It was the quiet moments that mattered, the moments where Max sat beside Ethan, his head resting on his lap, his eyes filled with love. It was the moments when they were simply together, no words needed. One day, while they were at the park, Ethan watched as Max chased after a frisbee, his tail wagging with unrestrained joy. It was a moment that felt like a full circle. The dog who had once been lost, confused and broken, was now the dog who lived every day to its fullest. And Ethan, who had once been lost in his own sorrow, was now filled with purpose, with hope, with a love that had healed him. As they sat on the grass together watching the sun set over the horizon, Ethan knew that their journey was far from over. There would always be challenges, always moments of uncertainty, but there was also love, and with love they could face anything. Max had come home, and so had Ethan. The story of Ethan and Max was not just a tale of rescue and recovery. It was a story of healing, of second chances, of the deep, unspoken bond that can exist between a man and his dog. It was a story that reminded us that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from what we lose, but from what we find along the way. In the end, Ethan didn't just find Max again, he found himself. And in the process, he learned that love, trust, and patience could mend even the deepest wounds. Max was more than a dog. He was a reminder that with perseverance, everything broken could be fixed, every lost piece could be found, and every broken heart could heal. And together they would face whatever came next, with courage, with love, and with the unshakable knowledge that they were never truly alone.